Today we're heading beneath the waves on the Holderness coast, a stretch of Yorkshire shoreline. There's a real story playing out. It's home to one of the UK's most productive crab and lobster fisheries, and there's a fine balance between what the sea gives and what fishermen take. My guest today is Nick Rooke, a PhD researcher at the University of Hull, whose work digs right into the heart of that balance, looking at the role bait plays in the lives of crab and lobsters and whether we're shaping the marine world more than we realise. It's a kind of research that doesn't just stay on paper, it could have a real consequence for coastal communities and the future of the fishery itself. We are also delighted to welcome Magnus Johnson, Senior Marine Science Lecturer and also at the University of Hull, and a well-known, respected friend of the show. Welcome to you both, guys.
Lovely to be here, Jim. Pleased to be here.
Thank you. Great to have you here. I'll just start by asking Nick, what drew you to the Holderness fishery?
Well, I'm from Barnsley in South Yorkshire originally, which is about as landlocked as you can get. But like many from that kind of region, I used to go on holiday to Bridlington, which is the kind of main town on the Holderness coast, and fell in love with it, still am. And basically my earliest memories are from being fascinated by the whole fishing industry, the sea life, everything about it. I used to be up there, and in those days as well, when I was a child, it was mainly a whitefish port. In fact, I think it was probably around the time where whitefish landings were at the peak in the mid-80s is when I used to go down to the observation deck at the fish quay and watch the catch being landed, and just be completely obsessed with everything to do with the sea and fishing. And so we used to do family holidays. We used to go to spend days on the beach, and I used to basically spend that whole time going around looking for crabs under rocks and things like that, killing time until I could go fishing myself on the harbour wall at night. For me, it was all about that, and I lived for it. We had a caravan at Flamborough, which is kind of chalk promontory that kind of demarcates the northern end of the Holderness, really. And we used to have a caravan up there, and I used to go down to North Landing where they still had kind of traditional Yorkshire cobbles going out fishing. I used to wait for them to come in, and they'd put, for some reason, I'm not entirely sure why, but I distinctly remember they'd put the undersized catch, the crabs that they'd caught, they'd kind of put back in the water when they got back to shore. So I'd go in and run around collecting them all in my bucket to look at, and I would just, for me, it's magic, it's almost a romantic thing. And yeah, and so when this kind of PhD position came up about the Holderness coast and the fishery and everything else, it's almost like I'd written the thing myself, because I felt like I'd won the golden ticket when I saw this. There was nothing I could imagine studying and doing more than this. So that's, in a nutshell, why I was, drawn to it.
So would I be right in saying that's the first thing you did
as a child?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You weren't working at something else and then moved on to
sorry.
that?
No. On the contrary, before I even knew what this was, I wanted to be a marine biologist. I used to talk about sea life, talk about everything, talk about this stuff. And my dad, bless him, said, it sounds like you should be a marine biologist, like when I was 5 or something ridiculous. And that is what I wanted to be all the way through primary school, all the way through secondary school. And I can remember having a chat with our careers advisor at school around the kind of, when I was in what would have been third year at the time, year 9, I think they call it now. And he said, what do you want to be? And I said, I want to be a marine biologist. And he basically, and not in a mean way, I have to say, I don't want to be mean-spirited, but he basically said it was unviable. You can't do that. Barnsley lad, there's no future in it, basically. In many ways, my ambition kind of fell apart there, and I didn't really take school seriously then. After that, I thought, it was kind of, what's the point, and I just finished. I got some GCSEs and whatever, and then I went from there to do some meaningless, for me at least, jobs, 1 or 2 things. And I'm also a musician, so I'm always been a musician, and I ended up as a mature student in my early 20s going to music college and following that line of work, and ended up, as well as doing gigs and this and that, ended up being a music teacher in schools and in further education colleges as well. And then I also eventually moved over to the East Riding when I became a peripatetic music teacher, which so that is the instrumental teachers that go around schools teaching, well, in my case, guitar and keyboards. But I was never that happy with it. I love music, but I just wasn't happy. And this idea of wanting to work in marine science never left, in spite of the fact that I'd kind of quite a number of years by this time doing something entirely different. And I ended up just changing and restudying, if you like. So, and found my way to this position now where I feel like I've been brought back to life almost, like Lazarus.
The fascination from listening to that, Nick, is first of all, when you mentioned your father's view, do you think that was somebody thinking of marine biology and coming from a very landlocked background and not seeing the potential other than just maybe something that you feel, oh, it's a wee fad in my life I would like to do, but could he maybe not see what you were seeing?
Yeah, my dad did. That's the thing. My dad was, unlike most kind of Barnsley dads, if you like, from what I'd seen. He was very bright, very intelligent, very artistic. He was he was more than anything else really supportive and he believed. Whereas, where the careers teacher didn't believe, my dad did, if you like. My dad basically said, "This is what you should do," and he was all for it. I just wish he was still here, actually, to see that what I was doing now. It's the one frustration I've got in my life is that he's not around to see this, that I've actually got there in the end, or I'm getting there. I've not quite got there, but I'm on the right path. He would be absolutely. I mean, he was always proud anyway, but he'd be like delighted.
The other thing that from what you mentioned, studying and obviously taking it further than studying, is your music career. Yeah. Don't you feel music is something, it'll never leave you? I often think it's a wonderful thing to be able to do, is play a musical instrument.
Absolutely, Jim, and I can honestly say this, I enjoy my music now more than I did when I was doing it as my job, if you like. So now that I'm doing this, it's enhanced every aspect of my life, including the music. You know what I mean? I get more pleasure now out of playing. When I do gigs, I get more pleasure doing them. When I'm just sitting doing my own playing for myself or whatever, I actually enjoy it more now. It's become a different. It's almost like the lines have become unblurred. You know what I mean? And the music I can really love and enjoy for what it is, because I'm now doing with my life what I always wanted to do anyway, if that makes sense.
But you haven't lost the passion for the music part of your...
Absolutely not. If anything, it's been enhanced.
And what instruments would you play?
I can play quite a few instruments to a certain standard. I started out actually in kind of folky type. So I started playing in a Cayley band when I was a little lad, which again it seems strange probably to you esteemed Scots who are probably, and me from Barnsley. It seems a bit weird, but I kind of got into a Cayley music.
I was just thinking of giving Magnus a nod and saying, "You hear the Barnsley lad in a Cayley band."
He's very good. He occasionally joins us. We have a shanty band where I live, and he occasionally comes and joins us, and he's very talented.
Excellent. That's very kind of you to say, sir. Thank you very much. Well, the first gig I ever did, I was about 10, and we did a Cayley at the Polish Club in Barnsley, and it was just brilliant. And so I started out actually. My first instrument was mandolin, and then from there I went on to guitar. My first study when I did my degree at college was piano, though. I majored in piano. But I do less of that actually than I do guitar. I play mainly now when I play guitar and sing, and I write my own stuff, and it's usually kind of marine themed, which is no surprise.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Mandolin's a beautiful sounding instrument.
it is. I've got a real soft spot for it. It's what kind of got me started on that road,
And your first impressions of the inshore fishing world, there must be something that's come up and surprised you.
I think probably well, first of all, I was surprised actually at just in terms of the Holderness. I was surprised at just how many. We call them pots where we are. I believe you call them creels. But how many pots are actually in that small area? You know what I mean? How intensive it is actually. I think that's what surprised me, because it's not something that is readily apparent, from the shore or whatever. You know what I mean? And you can't get a grasp of the scale until you start to dig into it. But even from the perspective of a boat, when last summer I was doing quite a lot of plankton tours for our kind of mine's gone blank subcontractor to do some work for the local management body on behalf of DEFRA to do some plankton work. I did an awful lot of plankton tours up and down the coast, and there when you're actually at sea, you can see just how many pot ends there is. The marker buoys for the fleets of creels. So you can kind of get a perspective on it then. But I've been digging into the numbers, trying to get a good estimate of how much there is. And so I suppose that surprised me. I never realised how much, and by extension then, how much bait is going into a small area as well, because obviously the bait, each pot represents an amount of bait. I've probably averaging about 0.8 kilograms, something like that. And just how much bait is going into the system as well. So that took me by surprise when I first started digging in. That's one of the things that surprised. There's a few things that surprised me, really. I'll tell you what does surprise me a little bit is considering and we were talking about it a minute ago, that idea of inward looking and kind of, it's almost like a protective, when you're a part of a small community, especially one that tends to have an undeserved target on its back, like the fishing industry can sometimes have. What has surprised me a little bit is how there can be a little bit of conflict between or within that community, between different disciplines, So, for instance, between mobile operators and static gear, creelers. And that, because, I don't know, that surprised me a little bit. I mean, there isn't any kind of mobile fishing at all out of the Holderness, but I did some work a bit further north, and that surprised me a little bit. I don't know how you feel about it. I don't know if that comes as a surprise. Or...
I would say one of the things I feel, or from listening to both sides, I think if there were just maybe some sensible measures taken, and most of the I speak to, if they even said, right, here's an area closed to mobile, open to static, and then maybe a few months and it changes.
I absolutely agree. I think that makes perfect sense. I think the point I was kind of making in terms of we've been surprised is that when, at least to my mind, if you've got if you're like a little tribe, in this case fishermen, and they tend to get undeserved flack from, say, NGOs or whatever else, and it's almost like strength in numbers would be a better position to take, but what surprised me is they can even turn on themselves, if that makes sense, when they cut from the same cloth, really.
And what's the relationship like between researchers and the local fishermen? Do they collaborate, or resistance, or?
So I think that the kind of default position tends to be, at first at least, a bit guarded, completely understandably so. But in my experience, everybody I've spoken to has been interested in helping to an extent or another. And to be honest with you, I feel like half the time I'm as guilty as anybody of re-collaborating with the people who I find the most approachable. So it comes down. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So for instance, there's one or two in Bridlington who have been more overtly helpful, and so I'll go to them naturally because I am a bit intimidated myself by Does that make sense? Whereas in actual fact, when I've been in meetings and things like that, there's been a rounded support for collaboration, really, and science research and science. And so I think it's a failing on my part because I'm probably a little bit nervous to approach people who I haven't approached before. Does that make sense?
I don't think it's. I think you're right, Nick. I think fishermen can be, like anybody else, can be quite guarded about people coming and asking questions of what they're doing. I think they're quite used to being battered by the.
Well, this is it.
They hand out data and it comes back to haunt them later on. And I think one of the things we spoke about this, and I agree with, is that the industry needs to be gathering its own data for its own purposes, and that's partly what you're doing through your PhD.
Yeah, exactly.
Another thing, I think that I often find with them, the fishermen I've spoken to over the years, they're not frightened of science. They want it. They welcome it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that could be considered a misconception in itself that fishermen don't want that. Ultimately, they are the ultimate stakeholder in their own world. So why would they not want to preserve that to the best? And that is perfectly obvious to me. Having spent time and spoken with these people, they know the most as well. But I think that, again, coming back to the whole idea of an undeserved kind of reputation or whatever, it's nonsensical, because anybody who actually spends time with fishermen realise that they are the guardians of their own more fiercely than anybody else, really.
Moving on to, you mentioned, you brushed on it just a few minutes ago, what role does bait play in the health and size of catches?
So I've been doing quite a lot of work on this. And basically what inspired me was the similar work and research that's been done in the Gulf of Maine. So it's important to note at this point that the Holderness coast is pretty much exclusively a bait using fishery. It's a one method operation for lobsters and crabs and whelks as well, but it's all bait using. It's completely transformed from the time when I was a child, when I used to watch the demersal boats coming back and landing the fish. It's now exclusively a potting operation. And so, inspired by reading about the work in the Gulf of Maine, basically, which is obviously one of America's big lobster areas. And so I've been doing a lot, because the question they've tried to answer in America is, how have lobster landings increased and continue to increase in line with increased effort, which doesn't seem to make sense in terms of other types of fishing. Various kind of possible explanations have been put forward, such as climate change resulting in suitable sea temperatures for lobster abundance. Another really common one is the idea that the reduction in whitefish, the overfishing of cod, etc., has reduced predator pressure, and so that's allowed the lobsters to abundance to increase. But one paper by a guy called Saul Seiler explores what he calls the alternative fishers model, or the fishers alternative model, the idea that the fishing method itself is leading to increased abundance by effectively feeding the population. And he describes it as a hybrid between wild capture and aquaculture, almost like farming. And the reason that I got interested in this is because the fishermen I've spoken to at Bridlington on the Holderness coast, they feel that that's what's happening there. So we have got our own alternative fishers model, if you like. This idea that by feeding the ground, they're actually boosting crab and lobster numbers. So I'm looking into that, basically, and I think there's a good reason to think that that is the case to an extent, especially in certain areas, because it's very similarly, the lobster numbers certainly are just seem to just, over time, it's an upward trend. And this is in spite of the fact that fishing has increased as well. So it seems to be a similar picture, a repeated picture. So in terms of the size of the catches, I think that that's what we're looking into. We're looking into this idea that bait is actually kind of almost artificially inflating the populations. In terms of the health of did you mean health of the?
Well, the health of the health of everything, the species, the environment.
Because there are.
You carry on.
Sorry, because there has been work done of kind of, because fish aren't the kind of typical prey for a lobster or a crab. They don't go like, obviously, catching mackerel out of the water column, and eating them. So they're going to eat fish if they find one dead on the seabed. But in general, they're going to be eating food that's lower in the food chain than they are. Whereas fish, mackerel, and salmon, as the fishers use on our coast, they're of a higher level in the food chain. And so because it's not a natural thing, there have been studies done where it's shown that an excess of fish in the diet causes kind of health problems in crustaceans like shell disease and things like that. That's to extremes. That's when it's been exclusively fish or really high quantities of fish in the diet. So I suppose that's one kind of health aspect in terms of the target species.
And do you think it's altering the natural feeding behaviour?
I think quite possibly it is. I mean, just on an unrelated note, I often think about this because I can remember, again, going to Brid Harbour when I was a child, and I'd be eating fish and chips, and we'd be throwing chips to the seagulls, and they'd just be there on the water and they'd pick the chips up and all that. And at the same time as that, you'd hear stories coming from Newquay in Cornwall where seagulls kind of dive bomb and steal fish and chips and things like that, ice creams and all that stuff out of people's hands. And I were horrified at this though. I thought, it can't be true. Well, flash forward 20, 30 years, and that's exactly, you take your life in your hands now if you buy fish and chips on Brid Harbour, because the seagulls will take it out of your hands if they get the chance. It's totally changed, and that was never a thing when I was a child. We used to feed them deliberately, and it's so in that sense I have been part of the problem in the past, have modified their behaviour over a relatively speaking very short time span. So taking that as an example, I think it's perfectly possible that we could be moderating feeding behaviour in crustaceans, especially you consider. It's been proven, for instance, it's been shown, should I say, that lobsters show kind of fidelity to certain kind of things. Like, so, for instance, studies have been done on scourstone on wind turbines, and they've shown that lobsters will stay resident to those things, and that is probably largely down to the fact that there's increased density of prey items, so smaller stuff that they're going to feed on. So that's going to mediate their residence in that area. So it stands to reason for me that if you're coming with a continually refreshed fish buffet, you know what I mean, on the seabed, that it's going to potentially promote residence and by extension alter feeding patterns and behaviours. I think it's perfectly possible.
I think that I feel you're there on something I feel quite strongly about, and that's seagull. I feel it would be a really sad day I went to harbour and there wasn't the noise of seagulls. And
absolutely,
I've heard in various parts of the country they would be classing them as a pest. And my theory to that is maybe a bit extreme, but it's because, okay, they'll make a mess and they'll make a noise. But if they make a mess, it's because maybe somebody's not put rubbish where they should put it in their bin, and they'll maybe open a bag. But they're perfectly happy to accept a rat because they don't hear it and they don't see it. But a seagull's a pest. Yeah. And they want to...
It's a bit of a bugbear. This is a bugbear of mine, Jim. I'll be honest, because the amount of times that I hear people saying this, and get angry at the seagulls for pinching food and stuff like this. And I'm like, we have done this. I've done it myself before I realised, when I was a kid, before I realised just how quickly we're going to turn. And it's almost like the audacity that people can think, I don't know, it just really bugs me. It really bugs me that people kind of get angry and blame seagulls for something that is effectively something that a situation that we've created.
And also all they're doing is exactly what we're doing, feeding our young.
Yes, exactly that. Yeah. I'm with you. Absolutely 100% with you. And I think we're in the minority, I hasten to add, but I am 100% with you. I'm always correcting people.
Is there any risk of the bait supply chain failing in any way for any reason?
I don't know, I suppose, because the bait that they use in our region is repurposed kind of carcasses from fish that's been processed for human use. So the main two baits that they use is salmon heads for mainly for crab, to target crab, and mackerel frames to target lobster. So the frames of the mackerel are basically the head and the kind of filleted rest of the fish, if you like. And so I suppose in that sense, it's the supply chain of bait is inexorably linked to the supply chain of the fish in the first place, I guess. It faces the same risks as the general supply of food for humans, I imagine. I don't know if you agree with that, Magnus.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was speaking to Hans' uncle, our mutual friend Jim, who he pointed out that he's not allowed to use salmon to bait his pots, or he's been. I don't know whether it's a law or it's because Nick wasn't able to find a law saying this, but or whether it's just a practice on the west coast of Scotland that you don't use salmon for bait because of the worries of disease being spread by using salmon. There hasn't been much evidence for that being a problem, but it's something that. So Hans says he doesn't use salmon. And it's not a law in England, though. It doesn't. You can use salmon.
Was that law, or would it be? Because I remember the old superstition. In my father's time, anyway, they would never even have used the word. They would never even have said the word salmon.
Oh, really?
It was.
Oh, right. Oh, right. Interesting. Yeah. Well, maybe that's it. Maybe it's just a cultural practice on the west coast. So it's certainly not here.
There was a guy. He had a corporate hospitality venue up here, and he had a small boat and some creels that he went out the bay just north of Wick, and he was obviously buying salmon for the kitchen, and what was left of it, the bones and head and stuff like that. He started to use that, and he couldn't believe his catch rate just rocketed. and he didn't want to. He was telling me, and he didn't want me to tell anybody else.
Lobster. For lobster. Oh, interesting.
So that's maybe something for you to try. So, do you feel if there was a fishery down there, mobile fishery, you would have access to discards and as far as bait was concerned?
Yeah, and I think that there's certainly to some extent, it's very small scale. Kind of, they probably catch their own mackerel and things like that in season. I mean, I know that I've seen, but some of the beach launch boats, I've seen them using kind of whole mackerel, which it looks like they've got themselves. I imagine that was probably the case back in the day, wasn't it? When there was a lot of kind of mobile fishing, there would have been. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I imagine that was commonplace. Because there's always been even in the days when it were a troll fleet primarily, there was potting went on, static fishing went on. So I assume that's where they got the bait now. Whereas now it's the supply tends to go through the cooperatives, the landing companies. They buy the bait from them. So,
do you find a difference in behaviours and fluctuations between the crab fishing and lobster fishing?
in terms of what fluctuations
in seasonal and
the lobster landings spike during the summer, July, August time, and then I think we've got loads of graphs I've made and stuff like that. I haven't got them to hand, but the crab tends to kind of peak more towards the autumn and winter months,
And the concentration of Magnus has told me previously, the concentration of, pots as you call them, they're creels as we call them.
Yeah.
It's in my tiny mind, it's staggering that how many there is, but obviously you're confident that the fishing is sustainable at the level.
Well, this is the thing that in spite of this effort, the numbers go up. I mean, there's a graph that we've got, and the numbers go up and up and up, and then they drop away in 2017, and then they go up and up and up again and continue to go up. And the drop in 2017 were just down to the fact that they introduced the buried ban. So they banned egg-bearing lobsters. The general trend is going up, and there's a lot of effort, an awful lot of effort. So it appears to be, and especially I'm talking here about the lobsters. The crab landings have kind of fluctuated a bit more than that in general, but the lobsters, it seems to be, from what I can tell anyway.
It's really amazing. What I've said Magnus before. I can remember when there was a fishing, whitefish fishing down there, and a lot of our boats from Scotland, from Eyemouth and right up, would be down there at certain times of the year, and they would be in a few days fishing. They would go into the Lake of Shields to land, and whatever fish they would have 120 to 150 lobsters in their trawl as well. No, and there's nowhere else they ever fished in the year that they would get that anything like that anywhere.
And that was from this area, yeah?
Yep.
It's funny, if you look at the... I'm trying to think again, because it's quite stark, actually. If you look at what is it? I think it's DEFRA landings, and it's got, by ICE's rectangle, the areas, and the one... It's like they're all kind of yellows and oranges occasionally, and it gets to the Holderness and it's red. It's like that's the landings have just gone skyrocketed. It's, for some reason, it's just huge landings there. More lobster landed there than anywhere in Europe, I believe.
If I could go back a minute, did you say Flamborough Head was the north section of what's classed as a Holderness?
Yeah, so the Holderness runs from kind of Flamborough Head down to the Spurn Point.
So I think when they talk about Holderness, it's from Flamborough Head to Spurn Point.
Yeah, I think because the Holderness region is, if you imagine Flamborough Head runs inland, the chalk seam runs inland, and then it comes out again on the River Humber, and all the area that's in between that is basically sediment, the glacial sediment from the Ice Age, and that region is called the Holderness. So the Holderness coast is the region from Flamborough Head to Spurn Point. What
would you say is the importance of the fishery to Holderness towns?
So, well, I mean, the year that I was kind of looking at, because I've got data for bait sales and things like that, so I'm looking at 2022, and in 2022, £15 million worth of crab and lobsters were landed to Bridlington. So economically, it's significant. But I think and then also in terms of employment, I think for every one job at sea equals 7 jobs at shore. So it's important for employment. It's economically quite significant as well for a small area. I think it goes beyond that, though. I think it's all about the character, the heartbeat almost of a lot of these places is intrinsically enveloped in the traditions of the sea, of fishing specifically. And so I think it economically incredibly important, culturally incredibly important. I don't think you can overestimate that.
Totally. The part that I can't get my head around, and I know it's not your subject, but you might have a view, or Magnus has, but the whitefish fishing, is it a ban? Is it lack of quota? Because, I mean, we find pretty much around the world there's less fish when fishing activity stops.
I think it was I think various things happened, really. I think initially the landings kind of collapsed in the 90s. Having been increased steadily up to the kind of mid 80s, they fell away in the 90s, and I mean, maybe you can correct me, Magnus, if I go wrong, but it's my understanding that then the government were offering decommissioning schemes and things like this. Fishers sold the quotas, and in order to keep fishing, they went after non-quota species.
I think there's a few guys sold big trawlers that weren't very economical and they were quite old, and then bought smaller but better for potting type vessels at that time. I think they swapped using the compensation. So they get rid of their big boats through the compensation scheme and buy a smaller potter. And then I think what I've seen over the last 20 or so years in Bridlington is a kind of professionalization of potting as an industry. You know, the boats you get there now, they're fantastic boats that are made purely to go fishing with pots, with lobster pots. They're very efficient. I was on one of the bigger ones recently in the harbour. There's one that works offshore, and they've probably got about 2,000 pots in the water, and it's quite an operation. You know, if you get inside one, they're really well set up to do the job that they need to do, which is get pots in quickly, get the animals out, get them rebaited, and get them back in the water as quickly as possible in a safe environment for the fishermen. You know, and they'll have a crew of 7. These bigger boats. I mean, they're quite impressive bits of kit. You know, and I think that's something that's happened over time. You never saw those 20 years ago. You never saw a potter that would work 20 miles offshore. I mean, Jim, you'll know better than I do, but I don't think that was a thing in the 1990s.
Totally. And before that, I remember going to see my father when I was still at school, and there were 5 of a crew, and they made a good enough living. The most creels they ever had out was 105. And wow. I often think now, and when Magnus mentioned there 2,000, well, maybe not quite. I've seen boats up the north here, single crewman with 400, 2 would have 800. And I often wondered if there's a balance, not just on stock levels, but economy as well, because if just say there was less pots and less lobsters landed and the price went up, because let's face it, it's a high value product, and is there a balance?
Yeah, I think the problem the problem here is the international market. You can't. I mean, you'll know this as well as I do, Jim. You cannot get enough fish to supply the internet. There's always going to be a demand for international fish, and with lobsters, we don't. It's hard to buy a lobster in Bridlington. You know, they get exported and sent to Spain, Italy, France. You know, I was in the Azores a few years ago, and there were lobsters for sale in the restaurant. I'll bet you they were from Bridlington. I bet they were Bridlington lobsters and crabs, you know, and because they'll pay the price for them. And one of the things we see with lobster is a real spike in prices around Christmas time. You know, you get can you remember what it was this year, Nick? It was something around £30 a kilo for lobster, you know. And that's the overseas market that's paying that. These big Vivier trucks that transport lobsters from Bridlington down across the channel, you know.
Speaking to a friend, he had been in Portugal on holiday, and he was in a small fishing village and at a seafood restaurant just at the harbour in Portugal, and he was ordered crab. So they were sitting having lunch with eating crab, and he just looked out the window, and further down the harbour there was a D. Stephen and Sons lorry from Scrabster. So he wondered.
That doesn't surprise me.
He wondered if he was actually sitting in Portugal eating Scrabster, and he came from Thurso, which was just an extension to Scrabster. So
almost certainly, isn't it? Oh, dear, yeah. It's madness.
yeah, but I don't.
That's interesting, Jim. There's an interesting question there. So you had a business selling fish, buying and selling fish in Scotland. Was it international in the days when you were, when your business was in its prime, sort of 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Were you selling to Europe as well, or was it no?
Laterally, maybe different
Right.
species would be on the. But Magnus, when you think back, when you say that, if I think back long enough when I was really young, the species that they wouldn't keep, they would just basically throw them over the side, is probably the fish making the highest price on the market now. Monkfish was one of them. They'd never keep monkfish. Squid, never kept a squid.
Well, mackerel weren't a fish for eating at one point, were they? Or was it coalies?
Well, they used to. There was a myth we would never be allowed to eat a mackerel because we were told that it fed at the sewers.
And of course, although they catch cod up in the northeast, they won't eat them, will they? I went to a fish and chip shop in Dice in Aberdeen about 10 years ago, and I asked for cod and chips, and the guy behind the counter just about swore at me. So we don't do cod and chips. It's haddock. It's all you get here. And it's really interesting that distribution around the country of where different people like. What's Barnsley? That's cod, is it? A cod place or haddock place, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, but both, I think. But you can get both. But there's definitely like a preference around about certain places. Like if it's like that kind of when you ask for fish and chips, what is the default fish? You know what I mean? I think so. Like over here, it's well, I don't know, but like we were up in Durham the other day, weren't we? What was that? That was cod, weren't it? There,
yeah,
I think. That was the default. If you wanted fish and chips, you got cod, kind of thing. But it's different depending on where you went. Yeah.
Do you not feel? I know there's a certain feeling, strong feeling about it, around maybe this, not just this part of the country, but on different methods of fishing as well. When we talked earlier about the mobile fishing and static gear fishing, and that there's a real genuine suspicion for the like of Marine Directorate in Scotland and the DEFRA in England. The classic tactic to keep fishermen apart.
Yeah.
And when they're not agreeing, they're not a single voice.
Well, that's what I was meaning earlier. You know what I mean? It's kind of the strength, you're stronger together kind of thing. So you're suggesting it might almost be like a deliberate tactic. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. Oh,
it's seen as that with us.
Definitely.
Definitely.
If they can do definitely. It's you can easily pit people. It's the easiest way to conquer it is divide.
Divide and conquer, exactly.
I think if you pit one against the other, because you do get a lot of this, and it doesn't make sense to me. I was out with scallopers out who were doing the plankton toast for us. You know what I mean? And it's just talking to them, just a bit more, a bit of a fairer kind of a distribution of spatial distribution, things like like areas where they can fish and that. It makes so much sense, but I don't know.
I know the bone of contention with mobile fishermen is that all their traditional grounds, a lot of them, there's pots, and there's no control and there's no limit to what pots they can put out. But then they have to. That's ground lost to them.
It does seem strange that there isn't the same restrictions on supporting that there is on like the scallop boxes and things like that, where they can only like exploit one kind of box, relatively small, and the potters can go in that as well. And that seems a bit crazy, yeah.
Have you any experience down there with the ropeless pots?
I have any, no.
No, not yet. No, it's not something that's come here. It may do, though. As the numbers of cetaceans seem to be increasing, we're seeing more whales and dolphins on this part of the coast than we have in the past. And as they increase, if there's an interaction with the lobster fleet, which there's not a massive sign of that just now, then that may be something that'll come round, But it's not yet. Yeah.
I don't think it's big anywhere yet. I think it's quite expensive, but the feeling is as maybe there's more used and sold, they'll maybe become cheaper as there are more.
Maybe, yeah.
Made.
But the secret is to have a diverse fishing fleet, isn't it? That isn't just dependent on pots. So then you wouldn't have water just full of pots, and they would naturally then, town by town, would find ways to work around, as they did in South Devon, where they had this thing called the informal potting arrangement that Mike Kaiser was involved in. That sort of thing would evolve everywhere's different, but every town would evolve its own management system for a diverse fleet.
Do you not feel, on the point we were discussing there, the importance of, I said the importance of the fishery to the Holderness towns, but I could rephrase that, the importance of fishing and have diversity, have mobile fishing and
I think so. I think that I think actually, if I've spoken to, there seems to be a general consensus that fishermen will be open to that. The problem is there's so much in the way, not just legislation wise and things like that, but the whole infrastructure of the ports out there is set up toward potting, and also, I mean, I just look around the fleet and the skippers and the fishermen, and it seems to me that the majority of those will only ever have known potting as well. They don't predate. There are some, there are one or two older ones that will probably predate the transition from whitefish to potting, as I remember as a child, but the majority of them only know potting. So there's a knowledge gap, there's legislation problems, there's infrastructure problems, and it'd require a kind of a wholesale change in that direction. So I think that they're open to it, and it makes perfect sense, but everybody would have to agree to walk in the same direction, I think.
And getting fishermen to walk in the same direction is
Totally.
a bit like herding chickens sometimes, isn't it? Or cats.
Yeah.
Going back to when we were talking about the seagulls, the thing that fascinates me when I think of it, I could go back when I was a kid with when my father and his uncles, it was all family boats, and the importance in birds, and they would see birds doing certain things, and that would be a sign for them that there was a fishing, at certain times of the year. And that's going back to when I was a kid. Just the year before last year, I was talking to one of the most modern pelagic boats in the Shetland fleet, and he was watching whales. Now, when you think of the hundreds of thousands of all the electronics he has in his wheelhouse, and yet he was fascinated, not just fascinated to watch them, but he was learning from them.
I mean, it's not the same level, and I'm not trying to kind of crowbar my way into an early fishing career or anything. But when I were a kid and I saw like a raft of seagulls or whatever on the water, I'd be straight off to get my rod and try and be casting in. You know what I mean? Especially if you saw a little bit of wheeling and diving action, it'd be mackerel time. Let me get my spinner. So
yeah, but it was mackerel time, Nick. But the important thing that was important for whitefish men as well, because what that showed, invariably that would have been about this time of the year, maybe spring of the year. And I can remember driving up the coast, no, not me driving, my father driving, or an older fisherman, and there would be remark, oh, that's a good sign this time of the year, because yes, mackerel for going out there to catch them, but a whitefish man would be thinking, well, the food is starting to move and the fish will start feeding again. So it's a chain, and it's
absolutely.
No, we need the birds.
We certainly do.
No matter how sophisticated our electronics are. Quite often when you hear various ideas with environmentalists and things like that, you just think, if they just leave it to nature. Have you a view on that, Magnus?
On which bit, Jim?
Just leaving things to nature.
I don't think it's as simple as that anymore. I think there's a need sometimes to be active in how we look after the environment. Where I differ from a lot of people is I don't think you should split the environment up into protected and not protected areas. We've changed the planet, we've changed the world, and everywhere we are, there's human influence, and there isn't really much in the way of wilderness left. We need to look after it, and I don't think there's anybody going to argue more strongly for that than fishermen. They depend on a healthy seascape, to make a living. But it's going to sound like I'm prepared here, but I'm not. I promise you, I'm not. I just happen to have been reading this book, and it says what I'm trying to say better than I do. I was looking it up as you were talking earlier, and I was thinking, and it's a book called The Rambunctious Garden. I recommend it to you. It's a really nice book by Emma Maris, and there's just one short paragraph. I'll read it out. So if we fight to preserve only things that look like pristine wilderness, such as those places currently enclosed in national parks or marine parks and similar refuges, our best efforts can only retard the destruction and delay the day we lose. If we fight to preserve and enhance nature as we have newly defined it, as in it's the living background to human lives, we may be able to win. We may be able to grow nature larger than it currently is. So what she's saying is basically if we work with nature and help it everywhere, rather than saying, right, we're going to have a box on the chart here that's protected and we're not going to worry about anywhere else, we can actually do more. So what we need is legislation and policy that works with industry and people that use the sea, rather than trying to fight against them all the time, trying to make this is protected and this isn't protected areas. I completely buy into this thesis, that the rambunctious garden thing.
But do you not feel that fishermen, that's all they can do is work with nature?
Yeah, I think they do,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I don't think they can't not work with nature.
No, I mean, but I think one of the big problems is that nature is changing. So there are big changes affecting our environments. Things are moving north. So, I think the figure for fish is 3 kilometers every 10 years. The last time I looked, so what's in the North Sea is changing. And the problem is that our legislative and management abilities lag 2 years behind what's happening in the water now. So if there's a change now that we could use to reduce the impact on nature and benefit fishermen at the same time. So say, for example, there was another gadoid outburst. So we had this massive pile of cod turned up in the North Sea. Yeah. It would take 2 years for legislation to catch up, minimum. It would take 2 years for legislation to catch up to say, right, you can take advantage of that natural change in the environment, which means there's lots of cod there now. And in the meantime, you're not fishing for those cod. So you're basically wasting, from a fisheries point of view, you're wasting that resource, and you're fishing for things that you still got a license for, which may actually be challenged by the change in the environment. Does that make sense? I mean, it's just, to me, that's one of the big problems we have, is that management can't keep up with changes in nature and in fisheries, and it needs to speed up. It needs to use technology in order to speed up and work so that fisheries can work with nature.
Where do you see that, when you say nature's changing, where do you see the changes?
Well, at the moment, what we're seeing is a decline in crabs in the middle of the North Sea, and I don't think that's overfishing. I think that's likely to be to do with climate change? I don't know. I'm guessing there. But there's other parts of the world where we're seeing, on Maine, so that Nick was talking about earlier on, those lobsters are marching north and they're marching into deeper water. So their distribution is changing. Mm-hmm. And, we're seeing things turning up in the North Sea that weren't there before. So tuna, bluefin tuna are now turning up. And DEFRA have just put out you can now apply for a license to catch and release them, so anglers can catch and release those. Those weren't here 20 years ago. So there's things are changing. And that is an indication to me that their food is increasing in abundance as well. And Nick and I were on a boat. I think it was you and I together, weren't we? We were on a boat, we were doing a plankton sample, and we travelled north to Scarborough. The sounder was just thick with what must have been sprat or something, all the way north at night. Mm-hmm. Honestly, you couldn't see the bottom because it was absolutely just thick with them. So that suggests that maybe the food has returned for things like bluefin tuna and stuff. And we need to see opportunities for fishermen to take advantage of that. I think it's the same in the Clyde. I think the Clyde habitat has changed, has switched over, and now there's lots of sprat there and less of other whitefish, and so the industry there needs to sort of learn to move with the times and have the ability to fish for what's there rather than what isn't there,
The sad thing on that one was with the Clyde, they couldn't fish them because the cost of getting them to the only place they could market them, it wasn't viable, which I thought was sad. So maybe there needs to be some look at helping with infrastructure because when you talk about the East Coast, right up the East Coast, there was a good sprat fishing in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, like Nick was saying earlier on, it's in Bridlington is adapted completely to deal with lobsters and crabs. It's fantastic for that. It's really efficient at bringing them ashore, getting them on the lorries, getting them sent down to the markets where they pay a decent price for them. They don't have the infrastructure to deal with sort of whitefish at the moment. Really, there's very limited quantities of whitefish come in. Hopefully, that will evolve over time. I would just really think it would be healthier for fishermen to be able to fish for more than one or two species, and for the infrastructure to be there to support that and help them get a decent price for them.
Oh, definitely, because there's a market. My goodness, but how many million people are within possibly 100-mile radius of where you are, or less than 100-mile? So
a lot. As well, like you just said.
Sorry, carry on, Nick.
Sorry, I'm just interested in what Magnus was just saying then. It's almost like what you need is like a kind of a rapid response strategy to changes, you know what I mean? Which it seems impossible to implement, but if you could have, where you'd suddenly got an influx of a certain species that you could then, that you didn't have like legislative hoops to jump through and things like that. That would be an ideal scenario, would it not? Where you could kind of.
I think you're right, Nick. I think we don't look far enough ahead. So, for one good example where there's a difference between the American approach and the UK approach, the sort of appearance of wind farms off the coast here. There's been no real thought in advance of them appearing. There was no real thought as to how should we deal with that from a fisheries management perspective.
Yeah.
And what's been happening in the last few years, it's all going to change now because Trump doesn't like wind farms. But the Americans were coming over to the UK, to Europe, basically, and looking at how we were dealing with the interaction of wind farms, offshore wind and fisheries. But we're doing it retrospectively. We're looking at it now, not having thought in advance to think, right, what impact will these have on fisheries and how should we be countering that or changing our current practices? Whereas Americans were thinking ahead. They were thinking, right, we're going to have wind farms off the coast here. What do we need to be thinking about to support the industry? We're not very good at that. And I think we need to be doing that with climate change as well. I'm thinking, right, in the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, these are the changes we might expect. And we need to be thinking about how we change our management over time and doing it in advance, not waiting for. I know it's really difficult. It's quite difficult to predict what's going to happen, but we should be trying to put some effort into thinking, right, if that changes in this way, these are the management measures we can put in place in order to try and support rural, fundamental coastal industries, like fishing.
Yeah, we should definitely be horizon scanning rather than just reacting to situations, definitely.
Proactive instead of reactive.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, and that's why I asked you, Magnus, in your views on the changes in nature, because maybe I don't look at it broad enough or big enough, but I just don't see where we're capable of changing nature.
Well, I think we are.
We're just so small. We're just so tiny as compared to nature.
So the last time I looked at I think it was the North Sea cod fishery and what was responsible for the changes that happened there. And the paper that I read, I wish I could remember the author's name, but it was basically 50-50 environment and fishing pressure. It wasn't completely down to fishing and it wasn't completely down to environment. It was a combination of the two. And I think that's probably the case with other species as well. I mean, there's this myth that goes around about having that fish species have stability, that you have a stable stock, that cod numbers in the north should be, I don't know what they're supposed to be, say 100,000 tons or something, but they're not. They're not stable at all. They change. Every year they change. And fishermen are used to that. They know how to deal with it, or they have done in the past. And it's the management systems that seem to struggle with the fact that stocks change over time, and quite rapidly sometimes over time. We've got this idea of something called maximum sustainable yield, which is the idea that you have an equilibrium population, and that's how you should manage it. But what's the point of trying to manage a population at an equilibrium if it doesn't live at an equilibrium? I mean, mackerel stocks change all the time, don't they? Every year. So there's a job of work to do for us to learn how to manage proactively, as you said.
I think the general consensus of feeling around Scotland, more probably your way as well, is the biggest mistake that was ever made was putting a value on quota and license. Because basically now we're at the stage, don't like to think it's maybe you're already there, but it's seen in Scotland now. The chances of a young guy leaving school, wanting to be a deckhand, work up, be skipper, and maybe eventually have his own boat, it's impossible. It's absolutely impossible for that to happen now. And unless it's maybe somebody that owns a boat now, his son. That's the only chance a young lad has now of having a boat. So it shouldn't be a tradable commodity.
Yeah, I don't know. What's the youngest skipper in Bridlington, Nick? Any idea?
I don't, to be honest. Some in the 20s, though, aren't there? I think.
Oh, yeah.
I would have to be careful on that question up here, because speaking of a good friend, Andrew Bremner, and the boy Andrew, and I says to him, Andrew, it's getting really bad. You count the number of young fishermen under 40 in one hand in the whole area. He says, well, be careful, John. We have 4 on board the boy Andrew.
Yeah. There's some real efforts now. So there have been some real efforts recently to try and encourage young folks. So Seafish are doing some work on this, trying to encourage young folk into the industry, not just the catching sector, but onshore processing as well. And I think that's really welcome. I think that's really good to see.
Absolutely. So the wish now is that we're going to end up with Holderness with a whitefish industry and a shellfish industry. That's the big wish, eh?
Well, I think, because I think the problem is if you've got all your eggs in one basket, isn't it? What's his name? Bob Sterick, is it? Who wrote about Maine, the lobster fishery in Maine being what he describes as a gilded trap, which is it's a socio-economic trap where the price of these abundant lobsters keeps people pursuing that, and then in the event that something happened where the stock crashed or whatever else, there'd be nothing. What would they do then? It'd lead to kind of socioeconomic disaster in that area, and I think that's certainly. I mean, Holderness is a glaring example of all eggs in one basket, really, as far as I can see. More so even than the local area north. It's just all pot fishing, and if something was to happen where the stock were to collapse or something like that, it could be almost like the death knell to the local industry, couldn't it? Really.
You see, when you mentioned earlier, Magnus, I wasn't aware actually when you said about the boat, and there would be 2,000 pots and 7 of a crew. That must be a fair-sized boat. We're talking about the area Holderness from Canberra Head to Spurn Point. They must fish well beyond that.
They fish offshore. Yes, yeah. So the bigger boats don't generally fish inside 6 or 12 miles. So they tend to be further offshore, and so the crab fishery is a bulk fishery, really. So they have a lot of pots to catch enough to make enough to support the boat. It's the problem with the big fishermen have always faced this. If you have a big boat with a lot of crew, you've got a stressed skipper because he's got to worry about crew, he's got to worry about fuel, he's got to worry about the bills to keep the boat going. And a bigger boat costs more money, doesn't it? So there's a few in Bridlington. They're beautiful boats, but they're big and they work offshore. But then they're supporting a lot of employees and people on shore as well. So they're important. And so we've seen a drop in crab in the middle of the North Sea recently, and that's a worry for these guys, for the bigger boats. So hopefully it's temporary and it'll pick up again.
But is it not a cyclical fishery anyway, and it can take off a bit, but then they get them again, they come back?
Yeah, I hope so, yeah. I mean, there isn't, like I was saying earlier on, there's that idea of stability and ecology, the idea of a kind of stable population of anything is not many stocks that behave like that. Most of them go up and down.
When we talk about fluctuations in stock, the one story I always remember, which I find fascinating, my father told me that it was just after the war, and they were fishing in the Murray Firth, and there was 2 lossymouth boats fishing quite close to them. And of course, there was no mobile phones or anything like that. Now, bear in mind, this is just after the war. And the haddock was a bit scarce, and there were few boats trying to find some. And he overheard 2 lossymouth skippers talking to each other. And one had just hauled his net. And the other called him up and says, "Have you seen a haddock in that haul?" And the other skipper came back and replied to him. He says, "The next haddock you're going to see is in a glass case in a museum." and now there's more
than haddock here. So,
it's haddock everywhere.
Yeah.
So, well, I think we could maybe just fold up. And I'd just like to thank you both very, very much. And
you've got to ask the question about his dinner. His fish dish, though.
Good. Or you ask Nick. I don't mind.
Yeah, so Nick, this is a question that Jim asks. I think every interviewee I've listened to, you've asked the same question. And it's, if you had to cook a sea fish dish tonight, what would it be?
It's really hard because I absolutely love so much. In terms of if I could just go and select anything, and I don't know, it's really, really difficult.
Hopefully, you're going to support local industries in some way or another, but with your choice.
Yeah. I think. See, I do like lobster, but I absolutely love crab. So I think I'd probably go and get a Bridlington crab. I think straight up, nice. Yeah, it's a rubbish answer. Is it a rubbish answer? I really like it.
Yeah. What would you do with it? I remember Jim's a chef. Jim had his own seafood restaurant, so you got to be really careful what you say.
I'm not a chef. A nice crab linguine. How's that? Does that sound good?
Now you're getting chefy.
Oh, you're making me hungry talking about this. Honestly,
Magnus, it's funny. One of the things I found is I've been fortunate in my career to have spent time in two brilliant industries, the fishing industry and the hospitality, with obviously having a restaurant. And the thing I find fascinating is I'll be talking to fishermen, skippers. They love cooking. They'll take different species of fish home, and they'll be saying how they've been looking either on cooking programs and they'll be going into details how this really complicated dish with maybe a lobster or different species, usually whitefish. I'll have the same conversation with a chef, and it could be Michelin star or whatever. And his first and only answer would be, keep it simple. So the chef that's capable of doing anything with it, he just wants to keep it simple.
Yeah.
You would have thought it would be the opposite.
Yeah, fresh and simple. I think that's it. Yeah.
All I want to do now is go and get a crab.
Another thing I find fascinating, the number of people that have said to me, what's your favourite, crab or lobster? And I just don't think there's a fair comparison. I think they're brilliant for different reasons. I love the sweetness in the crab. I love the texture in a lobster.
Yeah,
I just love them all.
Yeah. I just love seafood. It's not a good conversation where this is going, because you're going to start hearing my stomach rumbling. It's going to ruin everything.
Have you got your crab ready to boil up?
I think I'm going to go and get one as we speak. As soon as this conversation, I'm off.
I was I've the good fortune to have been invited into the Royal Academy of Culinary Arts, and I had to go down for an interview in London. And little did I know before it, but I was sitting for my interview, and there were 7 on the other side of the table, and I'm not joking, there were chefs amongst the 7 who I certainly recognised their face from television and things like that. And they said to me, right then, we're coming to my restaurant at the time was the Captain's Galley. He says, right, we're coming to the Captain's Galley. What are you going to serve us? And I says, well, to start with, I would maybe give you an amuse-bouche, small taster, and it would be a crab sandwich. And they just shut their eyes and says, oh, we love a crab sandwich.
Absolutely.
So it didn't have to be something fancy and stacked high, just a crab sandwich.
Oh, crab sandwich. I can taste it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, guys, I'd like to thank you very much. And before that, Nick, how can people, or Magnus, how can people follow you online?
So you find me on LinkedIn. That's the easiest place to find me.
Yeah, likewise. I think I'm gonna get better at it. I'm not. I'm going to develop my LinkedIn profile. That's the best place to find me, I think.
Good. And as far as the university is concerned, have they a big profile on social?
Yeah. University Hull's got quite a decent profile on. I mean, they're on Twitter, whatever it's called, X, Facebook, LinkedIn. Oh, yeah. All of them. They've got channels everywhere. So
yeah. No, I'm very fond of that area because you maybe haven't said it or to you, Magnus, before. I had an office in Hull.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
And one in Grimsby.
Right.
Excellent. So I know. I can tell you all about Yorkies, codheads, yellow bellies. Okay, well, thank you, and we'll see you all again soon. And
Thanks, Jim. It's been great to meet you. Thank you.
Pleasure as always.
well, thank you. It's certainly our pleasure as well, and I'll be in touch and letting you know. And it'll be soon. It'll be going out soon, so we won't have long to wait to hear it.